Now, Marcus will pronounce his own surname when he comes up because it'd be an insult the way I pronounce it. He's working with Jaime Ataria. The title of the talk today is Empowering the Indigenous Voice in a Graphical Representation of Aotearoa's Biocultural Heritage. So it's about flora and fauna. Now, Marcus, with support from Jaime during the Q&A session, so Jaime hopefully will be able to join in, Michael, on the Q&A session after this. Marcus will tell us about a highly interesting collaborative project near Te Urewera Forest. Marcus will pronounce that later for you correctly. This is in New Zealand, and the project goal is to create a visual educational resource for Māori youth, displaying the forest vegetation of their tribal country, and thus providing opportunity to conserve traditional ecological knowledge for ongoing generations. So thank you, Michael.
Well, thank you for that introduction there. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Marcus-Rongowhitiao tōku ingoa, ki te taha o tōku mama ko te aroa, nā te kahanunu, nā te parau, nā iwi, ki te taha o tōku pāpā ko mai tahu te iwi. Kia ora everyone, my name is Marcus-Rongowhitiao Shadbolt, and today we'll be presenting on a project that I've been working on for a couple of years now with a big team and some of our kaumātua or elders from New Zealand. Firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge the Rarakia people and all of the 8 other family groups that make up this region that Auntie B mentioned this morning. And I'd also like to acknowledge her attendance here today at the conference. So firstly, before I start, I'd just like to give a thanks to a lot of the people who have worked on this project. We've had heaps of people come and go over the last couple of years to work on it. So I'd like to specifically thank Jaime Ataria, who's my supervisor, who is on Zoom at the moment, and he'll be able to join in later on for some Q&A as well. I'd also, most importantly, want to thank our kaumātua, James Doherty, who I'd also like to congratulate, has recently joined the New Zealand Order of Merit. And then also Kiri Huranui, Melanie Mark Shadbolt, and many others who have helped us along this project. Jodanne Aitken, who's just down here on the bottom, been my co-worker all through this project, and her and I started this in our undergraduate program actually at Canterbury and Lincoln University back in New Zealand. And so normally she'd be giving this presentation with me, but unfortunately she couldn't be here. So our story really starts with our kaumātua, James Doherty, who was worried about the loss of the Tūhoe Tuawhenua dialect, which is from the Te Urewera region in the central North Island of New Zealand. When his grandchildren would come to visit us, they would see many of the bird species all through the forest, and it was actually one that Bruce mentioned this morning, the korimako, or the bellbird. That's the common Māori name for it, but in Tūhoe it's actually called the kōpara. And so the names of these species hold a whole host of important ecological knowledge behind them. And so when his grandchildren, or we call mokopuna, would come to visit him, he became very, very concerned that his language and his understanding of the forest and his interactions with it would be lost to his next generations. And so that was where we entered the project. The loss of these dialects is not a unique problem to Tūhoe or even to Māori at all. It's a huge issue for Indigenous people worldwide. In New Zealand specifically, there was significant loss of Māori speakers throughout the country after the events of colonisation. Luckily and unluckily, in the 1970s, a movement began to revitalise the Māori language, and any of you who have been to New Zealand before will likely have been overwhelmed by the amount of te reo that's now all through our communities. Unfortunately, the side effect of that, which is why I say unlucky, is that a lot of this specific knowledge and these specific names from different areas were lost, and with that, a whole host of knowledge. So Matua Jim, when we visited him, very clearly wanted us to create a resource of some sort, which would preserve, collect, and help to teach his mokopuna grandchildren and future generations all these names. So we initially had a very clear aim, which was to create a static graphical resource for the people of the Tuawhenua area. And so the goal was to create a static graphical image, an art resource to teach children the appropriate names and the stories and the knowledge behind it. The second goal that actually came out of this was to document our collaboration. As we went on, we realized quite quickly that a lot of the time when this sort of research is being done, it's under what we call the extractive model. So the Western scientists will come in and they'll work with Māori communities, but their only goal there is to get the knowledge and to use it in some way, rather than to work with the knowledge holders in communities to help the communities and give back to the communities where they're getting this knowledge from. And so we decided we'd document our collaboration as well. We were lucky enough that we had some help from some researchers just outside Edinburgh, Scotland. Mariella is the researcher who helped us there and helped us put together this framework. Now, there's a lot of words up there, don't worry too much about them. The important part here is sort of around where it says draft resource, and it's this loop that occurs. And this loop here is the most important part of our project, which is that every time we had a new bit of feedback or a new goal or anything that we wanted to do or change with the project, we went straight back to our kaumātua. We made sure that whatever we were doing was completely 100% in line with what they wanted to do. And that meant we probably went back to visit him in the forest 4 or 5 times, and we've probably still got another couple trips left up there before it'll be properly finished off. So in a historical context, as I said before, collaboration between Māori and Western science has been difficult and challenging. The practices of Western science have often been extractive, and so we wanted to overcome that. We wanted to frame ours in what we call kaupapa Māori research, or the more common name for that would probably be an action research strategy. And so we took this into the interviews with us, and it framed the entire methodology for our project. We started off by looking at what other resources were out there. And so these are just some of the posters and tools we looked at that have been used around New Zealand, but also wider around the world. We've got some from Yellowstone down here at the bottom that look at the wolf interaction chains, and then a whole host of other ones around the world. And we took all these back to our kaumātua to see what it was that he thought was good and what he thought was where we should be moving with the project. So we got up for an interview. We followed a semi-structured interview approach, as we wanted to allow our kaumātua to control the conversation and only share what he was comfortable sharing. Sometimes we'd even get there and we'd only be in the interview room for maybe 10, 20 minutes before he'd get us all in the back of the truck and drive an hour up the road to some remnant forest that he had a strong connection to or thought suited our conversation, or to a marae where that was the better place to hold that conversation. And so we just did whatever it was he wanted to do. It was very much his project. And so it was when we'd go to these places that he'd share some of these stories with us. So one story that we quite often share is one plant called they call it the kaiweta. So the kaiweta tree is a very short, skinny sort of tree. Trunk would maybe be about that big, but the importance of it is that our weta insects would burrow into them, and that would be where they made their nest. And so kai is to eat and weta is the insect. And so the name kaiweta described the interaction process between this insect and the tree and its environment. And so the next part of it was our artist brief. And so we started working with an artist named Ilza, and we took her up there for a visit and showed her around the local environment and let her meet our kaumātua and form a good relationship between the two of them, and then decided that she would be the ideal person to go forward with this. So one of the things we did was we split up a bunch of the trees into these tiers depending on where they occurred in the forest and the size of the trees. And so tier 1, we have a very large, kahikatea tree here, which is our big native pine trees. The kaiweta here is our tier 3, quite small, but still one of our more dominant trees. And then the hino here was one of our tier 2s, which was that mid-range between the two. And so for our artist brief, the key things we were after was we wanted it to be clear and simple. So this is aimed at primary school children predominantly, to be able to see their forest in an easy way with those names recorded. So if it wasn't clear and it wasn't simple, it wouldn't get across to them. It needed to be functional as a template as well. We wanted to be able to take this to other iwi, to other Indigenous communities, and to use it as a way to also show their local environment and those key names. Another key thing was we wanted it to be ecologically realistic. So the poster wanted to be at eye level. So when you enter into one of these forest systems, the canopy is often so thick you can't see the upper levels of the trees. So what you can see and what you can use to identify is bark and roots. And so we wanted the barks and the roots in our poster to come across the clearest and the most obvious to someone who's trying to engage and learn from it. The appropriate placement of words in kōrero, so making sure we do still have the story behind those words, so people can understand the real importance behind them, and to show relationships. So if a tree occurs at 600 meters altitude and another tree occurs at 1,000, then there's no point having them together in the poster because there's no way they would ever occur naturally next to each other. And so we wanted the poster to show that as well, and show that certain animals and insects only interact with a certain species of tree and will never ever be found on another. So going back, this was one of the key things we spoke about with our kaumātua. This is that feedback loop I spoke of earlier, where we continually went back and spoke to our kaumātua and made sure that everything we were doing was tika, was good, was correct. And so we'd visit his home here. This is just a picture here of his shed out here. His house is in the middle of nowhere. You have to drive for about 2 hours from the nearest town, and then even then you're on shingle roads for about another hour of that before you find a mailbox, which you tuck off the side of the road to, and then drive another 30-40 minutes into the bush probably before you find the first little shack tucked away. And it's a beautiful place there. And this was sort of the in progress of our artwork. So on the left here was the initial sketch we had from our artist Ilza when she first came over to visit. And then she went away and came back with some practice artwork. And on the far right here, we have the first of the 3 panels we commissioned completed. And so the artwork is completed. Our 3 panels here, which you can see on the right, are finished, and the artist has done with her part. But the kaumātua had a bit of difficulties, is what I'm talking about, the feedback loop. We went back with this poster with identifying a number of the tree species in the image. And so we've come back now. This was only a couple of weeks ago. We went to visit again and have got some new plans and some new ideas together. So initially we'd wanted this image on the right here, which shows the 3 panels ascending. And that's what I was talking about earlier with the altitude. So the panel on the far left here is the low altitude down by the river systems. And then as you work your way up to the 3rd panel, that's what occurs at the very top of the hills. We also have in the first panel, which you can see larger on the left, kiriru, which is our native wood pigeon, and they only really occur in a couple of the tree species. And so that one there is a toro meadow, which has the toro berry, and meadow is like that's the way that the bird interacts with the tree. It's the way it eats the berries of the tree. And so we wanted to keep that all together and included in the poster. Unfortunately, some of our bark detail wasn't quite up to scratch for the kaumātua. So we've now decided that we're going to have a separate poster for each panel, and then also have a 3rd poster of all 3 artworks together with some of the kōrero and story that surrounds the project as a whole displayed. And that's just so that we can have as much ecological realism as we can across the project. And so it came with a few challenges. One of the major challenges was that Jodan and I first started on this as undergraduates. It was our first program. We'd never done any sort of research before. And so we made every mistake you can possibly make on your first attempt at something. But we had some good support. We had our supervisor Jamie with us, who's also again here to answer questions at the end as well. And so we really struggled to begin with to realistically display the forest, which is why we sort of came up with these ideas of the altitude differences between the posters, having photos of the bark alongside it, having those relationships between insects and birds along with the plant species. And it was difficult to reconcile with our kaumātua some of those differences. There were some things that he was dead set on, and we we couldn't change. Sorry, we couldn't change. They had to be in the poster, and some of them were the more difficult things to add, obviously. So the future potential of this work is that we can broaden it out to other iwi and other Indigenous groups around the country, and potentially in other nations as well, if anyone was open to working with us. And yeah, at its roots, this work is about providing tools to Indigenous peoples to protect their knowledge, to store their knowledge, and to pass it on to future generations. Thank you for listening.
Sure. Okay, so first up, as Marcus described really clearly, our elders set us a very, very high bar. If you, what Marcus hasn't talked about is actually how dense that bush, that native bush is in the Te Urewera National Park, and so trying to create some sort of artistic impression of what the kaumātua was wanting was actually really, really difficult, and our artists actually struggled quite a bit with how to do that. So yeah, so the first thing was so that was a real issue, and secondly, I think our kaumātua didn't want just all of the trees put into one pitch. He wanted them, as Marcus said, wanted them because certain trees grow with other certain trees. Some trees only grow at certain altitude. So again, it was a very extensive brief that he gave us, yeah, but I think we've managed to sort of cross a lot of those challenges, and I think the other challenge, which others may or may not appreciate, is it's more of a cultural one. So again, we have a very strong view in our Māori culture that and Marcus talked about this extractive process. So scientists and researchers have often been called harori rangitahi, which means one-day mushrooms. So the notion of actually going up, extracting what you need, and then doing it in efficient and effective ways, and then leaving the community. So we've had to repeated trips back to our kaumātua to just reground what we're doing, and also to ensure that we're being accurate and as representative of what his wishes are. So again, that's required quite a bit of traveling, but I think hopefully you'll all agree that where we've ended up, and there's a little bit of a journey to go, it's really great, and it's really good. It'll be a really great resource for them.
Do you want to add anything to that, Marcus?
No, that's about it. Yeah, the dense forest was definitely the bit I missed. That was hard enough to get through, even harder to draw.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. And Jamie, a fantastic contribution, and we'll hear more about the project later.